you were looking at the world?
No, it's just that my point is simply that when my wife and I tried to have a child, the first two were miscarriages, and I realized how little I knew and how helpless I was to help her. And so when Joshua was born, the third birth, I was determined to be a good, old-fashioned, old-school father. And I thought that was much, much more important than what people thought about me or my political views or anything else. But I think it did determine a great deal about what I became afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And so when you said you wanted to become an old-fashioned, old-school father as a consequence of this challenge, how did that manifest itself to you? What was it? You said you strove to take on more responsibility, and you made that clear to your wife. Yeah. And you also regard the decision to take on that responsibility as something that was transformative morally, but also intellectually, which is what we're going to get into. Yeah. And what did it mean to you to become an old-fashioned, old-school father, as opposed to, let's say, what?
Well, by that I mean the thing that did rescue me was sports. I got kicked out of a few schools, mainly because I was always challenging authority. And I think if you speak to a lot of my peers, in fact, a friend of mine, David, I won't say his surname because he might be upset if I tell you, but I was with his son, and his son asked a question about me, and we'd been drinking a lot of really good wine at the time. And David just said, Alex is just unmanageable. And I think that this is something that had led me into lots of problems at school. And my father did the old-fashioned thing of saying, you need some boundaries, you need a routine, you need to be able to work through a process in order to go from A to B. You need to be able to become good at something.
Right, so the adoption of a disciplinary framework.
Exactly. And so and rowing is brutal in that sense. I mean, we don't run into one another, but we lift a lot of weights. We train 2 or 3 times a day. It's complete and utter dedication. And this is, once you get onto that treadmill, what happens is that your body changes very quickly. The perception of yourself changes as well. You become big and strong and fit. And also because you don't do any of the things that your peers might be doing, such as taking drugs or drinking wine or getting drunk at parties. All of this is
sacrificed.
All these landmines are avoided.
So why did you do it? If you were unmanageable and you were a discipline problem in school, why were you willing to subjugate yourself to the discipline of rowing? And
because of glory. And I think glory is important. And I think we live in a glory-free world. In fact, with the Queen's passing, what was interesting was suddenly that we started to hear beautiful and sublime language again. And it's in contrast to the very clunky, bureaucratic language that we now hear more and more. This idea of glory for me has always mattered.
So when your father proposed the rowing as an option, were you familiar with it at all?
No, not really, no. In fact, I was surprised that my father had been a rower. But then it turns out that my grandfather was a rower as well, and it also turns out that Story is a Norwegian name. STORR means big in Norwegian, and I'm 6'8", and we have Norwegian origins. And I think if you trace the Story family back, we are Vikings. So I think we were always boat people in a sense. But no,
it's quite a transition to go from somebody who's making trouble like that to someone who's disciplined and athletic. And you said. So how did you perceive the opportunity for what you call glory? Like, why did that beckon to you, do you think? And was it related to, in some ways, to that impulse that had driven you to cause trouble to begin with?
Maybe. I got into trouble very often. I got into fights quite a lot. I think the idea of being physically strong mattered to me at the time. And it's something that I could control. I was impatient in certain things, but I liked the idea of feeling myself grow into a man, because I started at the age of 13, 14, and that transition, I was 6 foot. I was 6 foot when I was 12. And so going to the gym, in fact, spending some time with my dad at the gym was important. So all of this was was not subjugation. It was the desire to do it. It was this desire to be strong, and it was desire to push myself and to prove to others that child that was always in trouble could become something much greater.
Hey guys, producer Colton from the Daily Wire here. Getting a good night's sleep is one of the most important things you can do for your health. Just like your diet and exercise routine are unique to your body's needs, so are your sleeping habits. That's why Helix Sleep provides tailored mattresses based on your unique sleep preferences. The Helix lineup includes 14 mattresses, each designed for specific sleep positions and preferences. Side sleeper models with memory foam layers offer optimal pressure relief. Stomach and back sleeper models feature a more responsive foam to cradle and support your body. Plus, Helix mattresses offer enhanced cooling features to keep you from overheating at night. Don't compromise on comfort. Take the Helix Sleep quiz and find your perfect mattress in under 2 minutes. Helix mattress ships straight to your door, free of charge. Try it for 100 nights risk-free. Go to helixsleep.com/Jordan, take the Helix Sleep quiz, and get up to $200 off your mattress order, plus 2 free pillows. That's helixsleep.com/Jordan for $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows.
So well, it's a lovely way of conceptualizing the idea of the regulation of aggression, so to speak, because generally in our culture, we presume that a child's self-expression is limited in some sense by force by the external world, and so that there's an intrinsic conflict between the motivational impulses of the child on the hedonistic front, let's say, and also in relationship to aggression, and the force that society applies to inhibit that. But it's a much better idea to conceptualize that in the optimal sense as a kind of integration rather than as a kind of suppression. And so you could say if you were a child, you were physically larger, and so that is one of the predispositions to that is one of the factors that predisposes to a more aggressive temperament, because if you're aggressive and little, you tend to get pounded flat, but if you're aggressive and big, you tend to be more victorious, and so it maintains itself. But then you might say, well, what do you do in a situation where you have a child who's motivated at least in part by aggressive and competitive urges? And the answer should be that you sublimate that into something that utilizes those capabilities on the competitive front, let's say, but also disciplines and harnesses them. And the thing that's interesting to me about your story is that for some reason, you laid out some of the answer to that, you were also willing to abide by that disciplinary routine. So did you start enjoying going to the gym rapidly? Like, how did that all occur?
The gym was, again, it's an accident and a happy one. My father walked into a French Olympic gold medalist who'd been a fencer, of all things. And a gym had opened just close to where we lived. And my father got to speak to him, and the coach was great, and he
what made him great?
Well, because he was very helpful, and he also had Olympic gold medals around his neck.
Right.
He was very, very considerate, and understood that there are certain things that in terms of the training programs were set, and they were really clear. He's the one actually that told my father about the rowing clubs that I should join. So there was this fatherly nature to the coach, and also it enabled me to spend some time with my father, because my father was an academic and at INSEAD, and he would have worked 16 to 18-hour days. And he was always writing, and in those days smoking the pipe in his office. So you had some good paternal role models, both in your father, especially in relationship to the rowing and to his encouragement of you, but also with regard to this coach. And then, so then that seems to indicate to me too that when you decided to take on the challenge jointly with your wife, and because you mentioned that you wanted to be an old school father, that you already had a model for what that might look like in mind, in some deep sense, because you had been socialized optimally when you were a teenager, even under relatively, fraught conditions, given the behavioral issues at that point. But what's interesting is when people talk about privilege, I do claim that I have privilege, and my privilege is that my parents are still together. and that the rock on which the Story family was built was solid. And that's something that I think is crucial. When I was politicking in Northern England, in Wakefield, for instance, most of the trouble that you could see stemmed from the fact that lots of boys and girls had no father figure anywhere near the house.
Right.
And this is one of the things that we might be able to cover later. But there's a strong Marxist tendency. What we're witnessing is the implementation of Marxist policies. If you read Das Kapital, if you read the Communist Manifesto, the most important point in the book is the destruction of the family. It's the number one thing of the book. Nothing else matters as much as that.
And that's standing in the way of the establishment of the communist utopia.
Exactly. But it's the destruction of the family, as Marx says it, is important because it means we want people to have no past. We don't want traditions. We don't want people to be able to remember certain things. Because
you obliterate the traditions to build the man of the future. I mean, Mao did that during the Cultural Revolution when he had his gang of young people go around and destroy, a tremendous amount of China's immense past in an attempt to wipe the slate clean, which meant wiping a lot of people off the slate, by the way, to wipe the slate clean so that the new utopian man could be built. And that's also allied with that modern notion of radical social constructivism, which is that we're only what our socialization makes of us. There's no intrinsic nature. And so the idea, for example, that there might be multiple reasons for the absolute necessity of the nuclear family as the bedrock to civil society, that's just an arbitrary supposition as far as the Marxists and the radical constructivists are concerned. And so...
I mean, that we saw it in the Black Lives Matter manifesto. That's the key point, was the destruction of the Western family structure. So my privilege is, if I have any, is that my parents were there. And it wasn't always easy, because in those days, when you were kicked out of school, there was a 1920s style punishment that awaited me. I mean...
at home.
Yeah, it was pretty scary. And I remember, because in those days it was just one phone, and we had some gravel in front of the house, and me coming back knowing that I'd misbehaved. The teachers had already called saying I wouldn't be welcome back at the school. And then I heard my mother pick up the phone, dial my father's office. She spoke quietly, and I could hear on the first floor my father shouting down the line. And I was petrified. So
why do you think you have a positive attitude towards your parents, given that they were, because you could make a case that, the school, you had multiple disagreements with the school, and it's an open question in such cases whether it's the school's fault for being arbitrary and not dealing with you properly, or if it's a consequence of your misbehavior, and they report you to your parents. Your parents don't take your side precisely, or that's one way of looking at it. There's punishment associated with that and some fear, but you speak of your parents with respect. And so why is that? Why do you think that despite your fear as a consequence of the apprehension of the consequences of your misbehavior, you still have this overlying sense of the support and integrity of your parents?
Well, that's because I think they were right. I accept that I behaved badly. I don't blame the school, and I don't blame my parents. I blame my own behavior. And I think one of the interesting things about the life we live in is that the person who takes responsibility for his action is always more pleasant to meet than somebody who keeps blaming somebody else for his woes.
Oh, it's also hard to change other people.
Exactly. And but it's also easier to blame somebody else. And I think the introspection, and this is the sense of self-discovery, questioning what you've done and questioning how you did it, and what impact you might have had through your words and your actions onto others, I think is a crucial aspect of humanity.
Oh, that's the confession. That's the prerequisite for redemption and atonement, fundamentally.
Well, it is. I mean, that's the it's.
You have to know what you did wrong, and you have to come to terms with it, because how are you going to change it otherwise?
Exactly.
And you have to figure out exactly what you did wrong, and then you have to figure out how you might change that if you could, and then you have to be willing to. When you started rowing, when you started to discipline yourself, were you also, do you think, attempting to atone for your misbehavior? Were those things tangled together?
No, I had, there's a very romantic side to the way I look at the world. So I'll give you an example. I had a job interview when I was much younger, and the person asked, so what would you really like to be? And I said, is that a real question? And the guy goes, yeah. I said, I would love to be a knight on a white horse with a shining armor, rescuing...
How old were you?
I was about 25.
Oh.
Rescuing damsels and in distress. So I didn't get the job. But I just thought I'd let it rip. I don't need to be.
Where do you think that image came from for you?
I don't know. It's an interesting one. I mean, I started reading a lot about medieval history, and the more I do read about medieval history, the more intricate and beautiful it becomes, because there are lots and lots of things in the tapestry of history that are worth looking at. And so it's not just that once you get involved in that kind of universe, it drags you all the way to the beginning of time in a way, because you keep thinking that one occurrence in, let's say, 1190 was actually based on a presupposition, on a philosophy for 500 years before, and then you start to dig into this really, really incredibly rich soil that's our history.
Yeah, well, you can see the lingering attraction of such things in the grip of the popular imagination by, well, you could say the Harry Potter series, which has a real medieval element to it, and also by a series like The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. And I mean, that's a fantastically popular modern myth, and it's set in a medieval ethos in some sense, and that's also associated with that idea you had that seemed attractive to you about glory, which is also kind of an anachronistic concept.
Well, it is, but I think, I don't know if it is. In fact, anachronism is an interesting word that if we have time, we could perhaps...
it wasn't a criticism, just an observation.
No, I know, but I mean, but it's an interesting term because with the Queen's passing, all those people who were saying that the monarchy was an anachronism are now proven completely wrong. It's not an anachronism for the simple reason that it lives, it's dynamic, it grows.
She helped ensure that it didn't become a mere anachronism.
Well, exactly. But the point is that that's what families do, and of course, a monarchy has a very simple concept to understand. My son Josh understood that when she died, Charles would become king. If you tried to explain the French Constitution to him, you'd find it much more difficult.
Right. But, so she embodies something that echoes very deeply for everyone.
Well, absolutely, and it's a very simple. She's the top of the family. That's essentially. Or she was the matriarch, right? And a lot of people, a very small number of people, have been talking about the eventual demise of the monarchy. But actually, you realize that their support is very, very, very thin. And what you realize is it's not just on this topic, it's on every single topic that they push through. And the reason for this is, in my view, is the fact that it's not anchored in anything. It's anchored in theories. And the theories, they then try to impose these theories on a very complex reality. They're always wrong because the one thing that they don't do is try to understand the humanity.
Well, that's why they deny that the a priori structures exist, because that enables them to remain invisible. You know, if I start with the presupposition that you and your family are nothing but what would you call a relativistic manifestation of the arbitrary social contract, then there is nothing to understand. You can just replace that with another arbitrary construct. And the danger in that, I would say, apart from the fact that it's incorrect on multiple grounds, including biological grounds, and much more than that. But it also justifies your use of power, and that might be the underlying. It's so interesting because the Marxist types tend to claim that power motivates everything. And I always think of that as more of a confession, as an observation. It's like, well, your ideology sets you up such that you're tempted constantly to use power because you believe that people are infinitely malleable and they should be made over in the image of your ideology. And since you believe that there's nothing but power, that opens up the door for you to use power to obtain your, whatever it is you're attempting to do. Hypothetical utopia usually results in the destruction of many people instead, which indicates to me that maybe that was the point to begin with. So, okay, so back, if you don't mind, back to your son. You said, and we delved into that quite deeply, that his birth and your decision to take responsibility for that, which I suppose was being a knight on a white horse for a damsel in distress, let's say, also catalyzed an intellectual interest. And you started becoming interested in eugenics because of the comments that people were making to you obliquely about why your son was, let's say, allowed to be born. And so maybe we could track that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the most shocking part of that was when I was walking with my son. He was only 2, very small. And this woman came along and she said, "You know that your son will be a burden on the state."
Oh, yes.
And
yeah, well, you know, when the Nazis started before they launched their full-scale genocidal movements, they started to clean up the mental institutions and the old folks' homes and so forth. Any people who were in long-term care, let's say, who were a burden on the state, and they definitely regarded them as a burden on the state, and they further pushed forward their pre-genocidal movement by making the case that, well, not only were these people a non-productive burden, but their quality of life was so low that it was actually more merciful to dispense with them altogether. And that really, in a very serious way, went out of hand very, very rapidly. People don't understand the genesis of these sorts of movements, but that, like, a lot of the Nazi eradication policies had their origin in public health